A diplomatic earthquake in the heart of London. On a damp morning in the heart of London, as gentle rain traced the old glass windows of Lancaster House, no one in that powerful room could have imagined that history was about to change course. The British Prime Minister smiled politely, his right hand firmly shaking those of leaders from major economies, while his left skimmed through notes from advisors. Laughter echoed softly, glasses clinked delicately, all part of a diplomatic performance too well rehearsed. Everything was scripted to perfection like a symphony without a single misplaced note. Everyone knew their role, their seat, and the lines they were never allowed to say. Then the grand hall doors opened. No fanfare, no trumpets, no motorcade, just a man in a simple dark coat walking in his gaze steady, his presence quiet, as if he knew exactly where he belonged, even if the world tried to place him on the margins. Ibrahim Traoré, a name that until then many in that room hadn't even bothered to pronounce correctly. A young leader from a small West African nation, the kind of country they casually refer to as developing, stabilizing, or in need of aid. He wasn't invited to speak, he was invited as a gesture, a symbol of diversity. But he didn't come to remain silent. And then, when his finger tapped gently on the wooden table, that seemingly small sound brought the entire room to a hush. Not because of its volume, but because it signaled something no one expected. Someone was about to break a script they believed was sealed. In the next 12 minutes, he didn't just disrupt diplomatic order, he tore through decades of silence. He said what millions had whispered, had scrawled on walls, had wept into the darkness, but no one had ever dared say out loud before the entire world. And when his speech ended, no one in that room could return to their previous role. No one could go back to the old script. That day, they invited him as a symbol, but he walked out of Lancaster House as the man who rewrote the global narrative, historical and political context, the unhealed wounds of a continent, long before the camera lights began to flicker in London, before the subtle applause echoed across that cold diplomatic chamber. The story of Ibrahim Traoré had already begun, far away and deep within the still bleeding wounds on the map of Africa. Burkina Faso, a name in the Moray language that means the land of upright people, a landlocked nation small in size, modest in GDP, but not small in the weight of its suffering. On the day Traoré rose to speak in London, he did not come with just his own voice. He carried the echoes of millions of ancestral souls who had once been forced into silence by bullets and treaties. In the late 19th century, Burkina Faso became a French colony absorbed into the so-called French West Africa Federation. Tens of thousands of young men were conscripted to fight wars in Europe that were never theirs. Gold was extracted, land was redistributed, and traditional languages were replaced by French in schools. When independence was granted in 1960, what remained was not freedom, but subtler systems of dependency in currency, diplomacy, education, and even thought. Burkina Faso's money remained tied to France through the CFA franc system, a mechanism that allowed Paris to control the foreign reserves of multiple African nations. Military agreements permitted French troops to establish bases without approval from local parliaments. European corporations continued to dominate the nation's wealth, gold mines, rare earths, and telecom contracts. Then came Ibrahim Traoré, not from a parliamentary chamber, not from a political dynasty, but from the barracks, from the front lines, an artillery officer who had fought terrorism in the Sahel, and who soon realized that bullets could not defend a country from poverty if power remained in the hands of others. The 2022 coup brought him to power, at the age of just 34. With a face not yet weathered by traditional politics, he made a clear declaration: Burkina Faso would no longer be anyone's backyard. He expelled the French military, he tore up unjust agreements, he called for total sovereignty, not just in arms, but in ideas. To many, he became the symbol of a new wave rising across Africa, alongside young leaders in Mali, Guinea, and Niger. They call it the second decolonization movement, but this time without violence, this time with truth. And that's why when Traoré entered the London summit, he did not walk alone. On his shoulders rested the legacy of Thomas Sankara, the legendary Burkinabe president of the 1980s who once declared, "We cannot repay the debt to those who have looted us." Sankara was assassinated, but his spirit never died. In a room where every word was usually scripted, Traoré's presence brought memory, resistance, and hope. He did not come to be politely heard, he came to remind the world that history has not ended, and that the final chapters will no longer be written by the victors, but by those who were once forced into silence. When silence ends, truth speaks. They didn't give him the center seat. They didn't place his name first on the list of speakers. They didn't even expect him to say anything memorable. But when Ibrahim Traoré stood up, With no notes, no advisors whispering in his ear, the room of power seemed to freeze. No one anticipated that what followed his quiet tap on the wooden table would be remembered as one of the defining moments of a generation. His voice wasn't loud. He didn't preach. There was no polished rhetoric of European diplomacy. But each word he spoke fell like a heavy rain onto suits soaked in self assurance, drenching the entire room in a truth they hadn't heard in far too long. We did not come here to decorate your agenda. We came to bear witness. The air changed. The eyes of leaders from Australia, Canada, New Zealand, those used to orchestrating such meetings as if they were the center of the world, shifted from surprise to discomfort and slowly to unease. You call us unstable, while you're the ones funding that instability. One sentence, a boundary drawn, gone were the half truths of diplomatic decorum, like we welcome dialogue or we value cooperation. In their place stood raw reality, conditional aid, unfair economic agreements, military assistance, all modern tools of a continuing colonialism. He looked directly at the British Prime Minister, the man who, less than an hour before, had been the focal point of this miniature world stage, and said, "If sovereignty unsettles you, perhaps we are not the unstable ones. Maybe it is you, because you cannot bear losing control over what was never yours." No one responded, but that very silence was the loudest reaction. It wasn't the silence of politeness, it was the silence of a room stripped bare under the weight of truth. Then came the final line, one not written in any speech, not approved by any aide, and it became a symbol: we never asked to be your problem. But today, I remind you, you were never our solution. Perhaps never before had a statement of freedom echoed so powerfully within Lancaster House, a building that once stood as a monument to the colonial order, a place that had witnessed handshakes of peace after independence agreements, agreements drafted by those who did not belong to the lands they signed away. And then, the unexpected, that wave of heavy silence broke into scattered applause. Not the theatrical applause of political rallies, but something quieter, deeper, an unspoken acknowledgement. India, South Africa, Nigeria, Jamaica. Those who had once sat quietly nodded and noted the remarks, now clapped as if freed from a psychological contract signed decades ago. Traore did not argue. He did not accuse. He did not name and shame. Yet each sentence seemed to gaze straight into the core of injustice and voice the truth others had long avoided. Real power is not in being allowed to speak, but in daring to say what others don't want to hear. There were no PowerPoint slides, no economic graphs, no linguistic jargon. Just a man who tapped on a table and shattered an ancient diplomatic ritual with plain, uncompromising sincerity. And that precisely is what made his speech iconic, not because it was grand, but because it never asked for permission to exist. A global chain reaction, when one flame sparks a fire of resistance. No one had planned for that moment to happen, but when Ibrahim Traoré stepped down from the podium, he had unknowingly sparked a fire, not with flames, but with truth. A 12-minute phone recording filmed from the back of the hall was posted on social media by a South African journalist just 10 minutes after his speech ended. Within an hour, it had been shared over 1 million times. Within a day, it became a global trend. But what shook the world wasn't just the content, it was how people reacted. In Accra, at a cafe where university students gathered, a small group played the video on repeat. One of them whispered he just spoke for an entire continent. In Cairo, newspapers that usually avoided politics suddenly published the full transcript of the speech. In Lagos, a group of street artists painted Traore's portrait with the caption, "We never asked to be your problem." Across European and American universities, professors were caught off guard as students began asking questions once deemed naive. Why is Africa always discussed as a problem instead of being invited to shape the solutions? If all nations are supposedly equal, why do only a few get to write the global script? And then, the domino effect began. 3 weeks after the London summit, at a press conference in Paris, the French president was publicly asked by a Senegalese reporter, why does the CFA franc, a so-called cooperative currency, still require African countries to deposit half their reserves in the French treasury? That question had never been raised so openly, not because it lacked merit, but because no one had dared ask. Traoré had opened that door, and now it could not be closed. In Berlin, a sustainable development meeting was interrupted when a Ghanaian delegate asked why haven't Cold War-era resource extraction deals been renegotiated. In Nairobi, a student challenged the Minister of Trade, if this is equal partnership, why does the other side always set the terms? These questions were like tiny blades not drawing blood but cutting deep into the polished skin of diplomatic theater. Back in Burkina Faso, the atmosphere crackled like electricity. People flooded the streets, not in protest, but in celebration. Not because it was a great speech, but because for the first time one of their own had stood before the world and didn't bow his head. In the poor neighborhoods of Ouagadougou, children pasted Traore's quotes on classroom walls. In remote villages, elders sat in front of old televisions, eyes wet with tears. Not because they understood every word, but because for once they saw themselves in a space where they'd always been erased. And the resonance didn't end in emotion. In the 6 months that followed the speech, small but significant changes rippled outward. At the G8, for the first time ever, 7 African nations refused to attend unless allowed to propose discussion topics. At the World Economic Forum in Davos, over 10 African leaders signed a joint statement they would no longer participate in any Africa sessions not chaired by Africans. At international financial institutions, delegates from developing countries began demanding transparency in lending terms and real consultation rights. There were no mass uprisings, no revolutions in the streets, but in the quiet corridors of power, where the fates of millions had long been decided, without their presence, the air began to shift. Those once seated at the center began to feel their chairs grow hotter. And those who had been placed near the exits, like Ibrahim Traoré, that day began to move toward the center, no longer waiting for permission. The most important question now was no longer, what did he say, but rather, what happens when more and more people dare to speak the way he did? One speech, many consequences. When the camera flashes dimmed, the hashtags faded from trending lists, and the hands that once applauded in emotion returned to closed door meetings. The real question began to emerge. Can a single speech truly change a system? Or was it merely a fleeting storm of sentiment inside the rooms where strategic analysts pore over global maps? Silence does not mean consensus. After Ibrahim Traoré's speech, a flurry of memos circulated between embassies, intelligence agencies, and foreign ministries. From Washington to Paris, from Brussels to Ottawa, a new label began appearing in reports: unpredictable leadership in West Africa. Traoré didn't just disrupt the order, he challenged the right to rewrite it. And in the eyes of global power brokers, that spells instability. From that point on, a cascade of unspoken consequence began to form. The price of truth under Traoré's leadership. Burkina Faso began facing invisible but highly effective forms of pressure. Aid packages were suspended, international cooperation projects were put on hold for review, global banks increased the country's investment risk ratings. Reports suggested that mining companies were quietly encouraged to shift operations to more stable nations. At a higher level, isolation became increasingly visible. Burkina Faso was excluded from informal donor state meetings. At the United Nations, its representatives were often moved to the end of speaker lists or had their time slashed. This is a form of silent punishment, no public declarations, no formal sanctions, but devastating in its ability to pressure a nation back into cooperation. Because in today's system, power doesn't need to shout. It only needs to withhold what people have come to expect. Hero or reckless gambler. On the other side, some observers began to ask, is Ibrahim Traoré a courageous leader, or is he pushing his country into unnecessary isolation? The truth is undeniable. Burkina Faso remains one of the poorest countries on earth. No matter how strong the spirit of independence, an economy cannot survive on dignity alone. The numbers speak for themselves. Unemployment rates, medicine imports, defense spending all depend heavily on international connectivity. But is that connectivity truly voluntary or just a modern form of dependency? That is the fundamental tension. When a small nation demands equality, the world doesn't respond with dialogue, but with defensiveness. Leaders of powerful nations, though they may not say it aloud, understand that accepting a speech like Traoré's would mean rewriting the rules of the game, and that could leave those who once designed the system stranded in the very game they built. Regional isolation. Traoré's speech also placed many African leaders in a difficult position. On one hand, they couldn't deny the power and inspiration of his message. On the other, they couldn't immediately follow in his footsteps because their own national power structures were still deeply entwined with traditional Western alliances. Some chose silence. Others expressed mild support through state-run media. But most understood one thing clearly: the sudden rise of a figure like Traoré could create internal political pressure. If he could do it, why can't we? That question didn't just come from journalists or academics, but from everyday citizens, and that for governments trying to preserve stability could be a threat. A symbol, in the limits of symbolism. No one denies that Ibrahim Traoré has become a symbol, but a symbol without political traction is easily isolated. After his speech, Traoré declined interviews. He refused to join diplomatic negotiation rounds. He stuck to his message, "I've said what needed to be said." That earned him reverence, but also raised concerns. Is he building a real movement, or was this just a one time shock? History has seen many leaders who gave speeches for the ages, but failed to turn passion into policy. The unanswered question: a speech can move the world's emotions, but can it shift policy? Can it reform international financial systems? Can it change how corporations assess investment risks? If not, then Traore's speech will enter the books as a powerful moment, but one left unfinished. But if yes, then it must be followed by action, because no one can take down a system with sentiment alone. When the silent speak, the powerful must listen. 7 years have passed since Ibrahim Traoré walked into Lancaster House. The London rain falls today just as it did then, quiet, unrelenting, as if time itself hadn't changed. But the world has. In the very room where he was once seated near the exit seats are now arranged alphabetically. Countries once labeled as problems are now invited to the table as equals. No more pre-written agendas crafted by others. No more hollow speeches about development cooperation while the deals remain one-sided. Traore is no longer a viral name on social media. He doesn't seek cameras, doesn't attend international panels. But his absence speaks louder than presence, like an echo that refuses to fade. Universities around the world have added his speech to international relations curricula. Youth organizations across Africa host forums on what does true leadership mean, and at global summits, the old question, who represents Africa, has evolved into who allows Africa to represent itself. But perhaps his greatest legacy isn't the speech, it's that he refused to read from someone else's script. The deepest change wasn't in policy, it was in posture. The truth he dared to voice opened the door for thousands, not only in Africa, to begin questioning power structures they had long accepted as unchangeable. He didn't ask to be heard, he demanded to speak. And when he spoke, the world was forced to listen, not because he had power, but because he had reason. When someone once pushed to the margins dares to speak, it doesn't just shake a system. It reminds us that power does not come from where you sit, but from why you stand. Ibrahim Traoré didn't change the world through weapons or wealth or powerful allies. He did something far simpler but far bolder. He refused to be a background actor in a play whose script he did not agree with. And sometimes that is the most revolutionary act of all in a world that thrives on compromise. Traoré changed how the world sees Africa, not as a bloc in need of help, but as a force with voice, with principles, and with the ability to reshape the global order. His speech was not just an inspiring moment. It was the beginning of a global wave of reckoning. If you believe this moment matters for our world today, then share this story. Don't let it remain just a symbol. Turn it into a reminder that every person, everywhere, has the right to speak their truth. If one speech can shake the world, what might happen when entire nations rise to rewrite history together? Stay tuned for the next chapter.